We're in the Bodleian Library in Oxford today, looking at MS Ing 3764. That's its shelf mark, otherwise known as Jane Austen's manuscript of the Watsons. This is a fragment of a larger manuscript. We have 68 pages from a manuscript originally in 11 booklets. The manuscript was acquired by the Bodleian in 2011, relying on help from many organisations, including Jane Austen's house, Chawton.
The Watsons is an important manuscript for Jane Austen because it is the earliest manuscript we have of Jane Austen drafting one of her mature novels. The paper is watermarked 1803, and we believe that she is writing the novel when she was living in temporary accommodation in Bath in 1804-5. Nothing survives of Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility or Northanger Abbey, the three novels that we believe were drafted before the Watsons. So the Watsons is, we believe, her fourth novel in draft, and it is the first manuscript surviving to show us how she composed. So there we have on the pages signs of writing, of correction, of revision, of a novel developing.
The Watsons is an exciting manuscript because it's not been bound, it's not been altered since it left Jane Austen's hand, which is unusual for her manuscripts. All of the others, as they've gone into institutional homes, have been bound up or housed in such a way that it's quite hard to get to the structure of them. With the Watsons, we have the individual bits of paper that left Jane Austen, which means that we can explore them in ways that's easier than the others. As it survives, it's 11, or was 11 booklets, but we can see that Jane Austen constructed those from larger pieces of paper. They're now quite small booklets.
After Jane Austen's death in 1817, all her manuscripts that survived at that point were held together in a single collection by her sister Cassandra. We know that Cassandra carried them around with her in her luggage when she visited her various brothers, that often in the family they would act out parts of the manuscripts as a way of remembering Jane. So it's possible that manuscripts like Sanditon and the Watsons were discussed and even performed and embellished within the family. After Cassandra's death in 1845, the manuscripts were distributed according to the terms of Cassandra's will amongst surviving members of the family. And at that point, the Watsons goes to Jane and Cassandra's niece, Caroline Austen. At Caroline's death, it then descends to Caroline's nephew, William Austen Lee, and that's when the manuscript begins its adventures, because William, in 1915, the height of the First World War, gives 12 pages of the Watsons. Remember, it's a fragment, it's a large fragment of a novel, so he gives 12 pages of that fragment to a sale in aid of the Red Cross Society. This was quite common at the time. There were sales of all kinds of art objects to raise funds for the war effort. So 12 pages of the Watsons are sold at that point. 10 years later, in 1925, those 12 pages find their way into the Morgan Library in New York, and they are still there now, held safely in a public collection. The rest of the Watsons, the larger portion, stayed in family hands until 1978, when it becomes part of the British Rail Pension Fund portfolio. 10 years later, in 1988, it is resold and goes into private hands again. And then in 2011, it was purchased at auction from the private owner by the Bodleian Library, and it is now here in the Bodleian Library, safely held for posterity.
I was very fortunate to be asked to conserve the manuscript, and we took a very definite decision that we wanted a very light touch. The other surviving Austen manuscripts have all been altered in some way. We haven't altered the Watsons, so it's actually quite a fragile manuscript. And what I've really done is just some very light paper repairs from where there were some splits in the outer folds of the manuscripts. So it's lucky. It's had very minor conservation by me, and it's more or less in the condition it left Jane Austen's hand.
What's really exciting about the Watsons is that she seems to be experimenting with a new way of writing. It's a novel that is driven from the start by social realism. Her earlier novels were light romantic comedies with strong literary precedents. And this seems to be a novel in which she is finding her materials perhaps from within her own experience, and certainly from the immediate world around her. So she is starting to experiment with social realism which will then inform her later novels, the mature novels, Mansfield Park and Emma, for example. There are various reasons why Jane Austen may have abandoned the Watsons. It's about a sixth of the length of a normal Jane Austen novel, roughly 17,500 words. It ends very abruptly. One possibility is that the events in the novel came far too close to her own real life. So it's an experiment in social reality that may actually have foundered because somehow it anticipated and was overshadowed by real events. But although she abandoned it, she seemed never really to have moved far from it. She kept it with her all her life. I think the great mystery around the Watsons is that it starts so well. It's a new kind of realism that she's experimenting with in this novel. It's a story of riches to rags. Emma Watson, the heroine, a girl in her late teens, has been returned to her birth family after being away for 14 years. This is a family she scarcely knows, but she's been returned to them because her uncle, who has brought her up to that point, has unfortunately died. Her aunt has made an imprudent remarriage and she's no longer wanted. So this is a girl who's expecting an inheritance and a life of comfort. She's been returned to her family who live an isolated life in a village. This is a village that's not an idyllic Jane Austen village by any means. It's a village deep in mud, and the family who live there, the Watsons, are the only gentry family in the neighbourhood. They're completely isolated from society. They have bad roads in and out of the village, so no one really comes to visit them. They have no one to have tea with and visit themselves in the village. They're isolated. It's a family made up of an invalid clergyman father who is widowed, so there's no mother, and with Emma returned to them 4 unmarried daughters, Emma the youngest. The other 3 are aging spinsters, and they spend their time basically trying to find matches for themselves, more and more desperate to marry. And when they're not doing that, they're simply bickering. It's quite a dreary, dark, bleak picture of genteel poverty. So quite unlike the bright picture of, say, Northanger Abbey or of Pride and Prejudice. And we think one reason that it stalls and that she doesn't move beyond really what are the opening scenes setting up the narrative is that in 1805, when she's writing, her father unexpectedly dies. And what began as an experiment in social realism in fiction becomes far too close to real events in life. And somehow real events in life perhaps crystallized this study in bleak poverty of aging spinsters. They crystallized what really was Jane Austen's own condition at this point, far too precisely for her to get any creative purchase on it. And so she simply stalls.
The majority of the manuscript is written on a single stock of paper. So this is a wove handmade paper, and we have two watermarks. One is a WS and the other one's a date, 1803. We think WS is William Sharp. That's a paper maker who was in Romsey, just north of Southampton. There are two other fiction manuscripts also written on paper made by William Sharp. So it seems to be the most common paper maker used by, available to Jane Austen. But the letter paper that I say that she folds them from, that's also exciting because we find that exactly the same paper used by her in a letter dated the 24th of August 1805. Now she writes that in Kent and sends it to her sister. So we think the manuscript's written in Bath, what's going on there? But then we know from other evidence that Jane Austen often travelled with her own paper, or at least once travels with her own paper. She tells us that from her letters. So there's partial evidence that comes from the paper that allows us to have a date of the same use of that paper in correspondence in August of 1805. But unfortunately, there's not enough surviving letters for us to say when did she start using that paper and when did she stop using that paper. We don't quite know how much paper she would have bought at a time. Would it be a quire of letter paper, 25 pieces? The largest run we have from her letters is 9 letters, all written on the same paper. So, there's very sort of scant evidence from the paper, but there's some sort of exciting things.
One reason the Watsons is so interesting to us is that this is an early glimpse into her writer's laboratory. A manuscript is a kind of fingerprint of a writer. We sense from it how she works. We have evidence from the fragment of Persuasion, we have evidence from Sanditon that we can put together with the Watsons and come up with a sense of her habits as a writer. But the Watsons is the first place we see that. And one of the things we notice in the Watsons is that she is writing into booklets. At this stage, she's writing into booklets, each of which is composed of 8 pages. Later on, the Persuasion manuscript is also written into booklets that are thicker and fatter, and Sanditon the same, written into thick booklets. And so it's interesting to think, why is she writing into booklets? Not all writers do that. Some writers will write onto single sheets of paper, but she's using booklets, and not just booklets, but small booklets. There is a story that starts very early in the family that Jane Austen was writing in a social space, a space where she had no privacy. She didn't have a room of her own to write in, so that she wrote on small sheets of paper because this gave her a certain privacy. She could hide the pages when somebody came into the room and interrupted her. But I think there are other reasons for considering why Jane Austen preferred to compose directly into small booklets. And one of those other reasons, I think, is the discipline that it imposed on her as a writer. She enjoyed both discipline and thrift, that she is a writer who uses paper very sparingly. When you look at a page of the Watsons, any page, you see that she is writing to the absolute limits of that page. She leaves no margins, very little white space. And the booklet is a disciplinary force. The page itself is disciplined, it's small, tightly filled, but the booklet also disciplines her writing further. If you're writing onto single pages, you can discard a page if something goes wrong. But if you're on page 3 or 4 of a booklet, the booklet itself imposes a kind of tyranny on the writing. It is much harder to think, oh, well, I'll actually scrap those first 4 pages and start again. You keep on writing forward. And I think the discipline of the booklet meant that Jane Austen is perhaps creating the story in her head to a considerable degree before it goes down on paper, because she's not going to want at page 4 or 5 to think, well, I need to start again. She's want to be able to move forward. And this is what the booklet does. It imposes a forward movement on the writing. the novels before the Watsons, novels like Pride and Prejudice, have very stagey dialogue. The characters are in conversation, but it's often epigrammatic, it's clipped. They each take their turn. A third of the Watsons is written as conversation. And often this is conversation in which you don't always know who is speaking. Voices interrupt voices. So it's the kind of conversation that she's actually developing with much more sophistication in Mansfield Park and in Emma. And it's a real shift in terms of narrative style. It's another thing that makes this manuscript a particularly interesting experiment for Austen, the range of the conversational voice. Because she is working within the disciplinary constraints of these small 8-page booklets, when Jane Austen does want to develop her story beyond the limits of what she's already written, what she tends to do is actually apply patches to her manuscript.
So these are 3 pieces of paper which are cut and written on one side of them. They are then pinned in place in the main manuscript, folded so they sort of roll up, so you can get to the bit, unroll it, read it, roll it back up, and you think, okay, just 3 pieces of paper. However, again, looking at the paper, we can match up the marks from the paper mould and the watermark within the paper and see that all 3 are cut from exactly the same piece of paper and must have been cut before she wrote on them. And I can't get my head around that at all, because it's that sense that she knew how much paper she was going to need for each of the patches. So again, this sort of very careful control of how much text there is to fit in. What we also see with the patches is her pinning them in place with 3 pins, only one of which sadly now survives. But this is a common type of pin used from the medieval period up to about 1830, when the way pins were made changes. But it's 3/4 of an inch long. And you think, we all think of pins now, it's the sort of thing you use for dressmaking and so on. But this shorter pin, 3/4 of an inch long, would have been a dress pin. So something used to hold an apron or a bonnet in place. And it's a lovely thought that she's possibly plucking a pin from her dress to attach the patches.
She pins them in at booklets 7, 9 and 10. And these are sections of text which have been added later either to revise a section. So, for instance, she revises a conversation in booklet 7 that's going on between Lord Osborne, this awkward Mr. Darcy kind of figure, and the heroine, Emma Watson. And his initial conversation with Emma, which Jane Austen deletes, is quite insolent. He's asking her about her ankles, basically, which is something, no man should ever mention to a Regency heroine. And Jane Austen goes back and she ameliorates Mr. Lord Osborne's question. She gives him a softer tone, and she also expands the conversation between the two. So she makes it a rather more flexible exchange than it had previously been rather rude and awkward. And similarly, in section 10, it's Emma Watson's brother, Robert, who has a discussion with Emma about why she's come back to the family at all. So what you see is happening in these patches is Jane Austen is expanding the story, trying to give it a little bit more oxygen, as it were, and a little bit more that might extend it into the full novel that we think at this stage she was planning to write. When it was eventually published as a fragment in 1871, a critic who read it at that point, a woman called Anne Thackeray, described the Watsons as the anti-Ghost of all Jane Austen's fictions. It's a wonderful statement, I think, anti-Ghost. But what she's getting at is something I think that anyone now reading it would sense, that This novel contains the elements of what we recognise as a prototypical Jane Austen novel. So, for instance, its major event is a ball. It's filled with details around the anticipation of a ball, the actual ball itself, and then the discussion amongst the family and friends of the ball and what's happened with it at it. So a classic kind of plot element of Jane Austen. Balls are the yeast that gets Jane Austen plots rising, as it were. But also it contains characters who seem remarkably familiar from her other novels. For instance, there's a young Lord Osborne, who is very awkward, who doesn't enjoy dancing, but who is interested in the central character, Emma Watson, of the story. He seems like a foreshadowing of Mr. Darcy. Later on in the story, when Emma is sitting at home with her family, her sister-in-law arrives, a Mrs. Robert Watson. Mrs. Robert Watson comes from the smart set at Croydon, and she talks endlessly about what they do in Croydon and how they have magnificent parties and suppers and whist drives and so on. She seems very much like a rehearsal for Mrs. Elton. And indeed, she even has a daughter called Augusta. And of course, we know that name is not a usual name for Jane Austen, but it's used again as the first name of Mrs. Elton, who is Augusta Elton in Emma. Even the heroine, Emma Watson, seems like a forerunner of those mature heroines like Fanny Price particularly, and even Anne Elliot in Persuasion, in that she's rather isolated from the rest of her family. She likes nothing better than to sit alone, reading and thinking. She's a character who is gradually carving out what Austen's heroines do in the mature fiction, which is this internal psychological space, the space that becomes more and more interesting to the reader in Austen's heroines as her novels develop. So it's possible that the Watsons, although she couldn't find a way to finish it in 1805, became a kind of salvage site for her, that she plundered it in later novels, taking elements and ingredients from it and weaving them into her later fiction. So we can say that it's, the earliest of the surviving mature novels in composition, but it's also a novel that she never quite abandoned. There are so many questions around the Watsons, which is what makes it such a wonderfully fertile and interesting manuscript. And one of the questions really that we can't answer is, was it meant to be a novel at all? It's 17,500 words long. It ends abruptly when Mr. and Mrs. Robert Watson leave the village, and Emma, who's been invited to go with them, decides to stay at home in this dreary, mud-soaked parsonage with her squabbling spinster sisters. We assume it was going to be a novel, but unlike the other unfinished manuscript, Sanditon, it is not divided into chapters. It's possible that it was just going to be a novella, a long, as it were, a long-form short story that was abandoned. We really don't know.